Good evening and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Lyon Hall, and I'm the Executive Director of COLLIS Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture. COLLIS is a nonprofit and affiliate of Cornell University through Cornell United Religious Work, and our mission is to develop Catholic thought, culture, and community on Cornell campus through public lectures, non-credit courses, seminars, concerts, and cultural events. I am delighted to be partnering with Cornell's program in medieval studies to bring our guest David Albertson to campus. During my graduate studies here at Cornell, my advisor, Drew Hicks, over here, introduced me to Albertson's work, and we have both long admired David's scholarship. It has thus been a true pleasure to be able to work with Drew to bring David here in person to Cornell. I will turn an official introduction of our guest over to Drew Hicks, Director of the Program in Medieval Studies. But before I do so, I'd like to acknowledge that this event has been made possible by the grant in Lumine supporting the Catholic intellectual tradition on campuses nationwide from the John Templeton Foundation. Now over to Drew.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce David Albertson, who's an associate professor of religion at the University of Southern California. David Albertson is a wide-ranging scholar of medieval and early modern Christian intellectual cultures, focusing on the complex interplay of theological discourses with other modes of knowledge, including philosophy, mathematics, natural science, visual culture, and contemplative practices. His first and award-winning, deservedly so, monograph, Mathematical Theologies, Nicholas of Cusa and the Legacy of Thierry of Chartres, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2014, charts the afterlives, and in fact, the very much real new lives of Pythagorean and Platonic metaphysics in medieval and early modern mystical theologies, particularly those of the titular Thierry of Chartres in the 12th century and the German polymath of the 15th century Nicholas of Cusa. But that's only, in fact, 2/3 of the book, because the first third of the book actually takes us through not just the Communis Opinio, but an entirely new deep dive into the ancient and late ancient traditions, culminating in Augustine and Boethius of Pythagorean mathematical speculation. And he provides a patient, richly detailed, and illuminating analysis of the full breadth and diversity of Pythagorean traditions of number speculation. And I will admit that that book sat on my desk while I was working on my own sort of speculative work in the realm of mathematical theologies in my own research. So it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome you today. Professor Albertson's new project is no less dazzling in scope, and it explores the religious uses of geometrical diagrams and kind of visual cultures of mathematics in mystical traditions, starting in Platonian thought and extending well beyond, even again, into the early modern world. His published articles range across not just Thierry and Nicholas, for whom he's one of the world experts, but also into the school of St. Victor, into Eugenian studies, and a wide range of Neo-Pythagorean and other kinds of mystical traditions, always with a patient but remarkably clear, sort of penetrating analysis, not just of a kind of general mystical speculation, but a very richly textured tapestry of proper philosophical thought. So please join me in welcoming David Albertson for his talk today. Indebted, I think, to this new project, What Does Mysticism Have to Do with Geometry, Space, and Interiority in Medieval Christian Thought? David Albertson.
Thank you for that really over-generous introduction. That was very kind. I'm delighted to be here, and I thank COLLIS and Dr. Lyons and the Medieval Studies program and Professor Hicks for their invitation. We had a wonderful lunch with some graduate students, and it's my first visit to Cornell. I'm also very impressed that Cornell has so many folks come out for lecture on geometry at Friday at 5 p.m. So good on you all. That's good. Because of my interest in medieval Pythagoreanism, I'm often asked if I have a background in mathematics. I have to confess, I absolutely do not. In fact, I turned to history and philosophy in the first place out of despair at my college-level calculus failures. Instead, I arrive at these mathematical topics from the distant province of religion and theology. Very few of my colleagues in history of Christianity are interested in mathematics at all. But I found it unavoidable once I began to study Nicholas of Cusa, who we have up here and we'll see more of soon, 1401 to 1464, the Renaissance Neoplatonist. I began to research Nicholas's unusual sources, like the 12th century humanist and Boeotian commentator Terry of Chartres. For Terry and Nicholas, concepts of number and quantity and line all inscribe God's presence in the world. As Nicholas of Cusa, or Cusanus, his humanist moniker, wrote, as he wrote in 1453, if something is true in mathematics, it must be all the more true in theology. Cusanus, arguably the most important Christian author in Germany between Meister Eckhart and Martin Luther, is perhaps the only mystical theologian convinced that mathematics should guide his spiritual pursuits. That strange but profound proposal continues to stimulate my own thinking. And after finishing my book on Nicholas of Cusa's mathematical theology, I began to consider a new question. What do we mean by mysticism in the first place, if mysticism usually has so little to do with the the measurable world? Was that always the case? In other words, how exceptional was the Cusan project of trying to fuse geometry and mysticism? The late historian Louis Dupré writes in Passage to Modernity that late medieval Christianity still held together what he calls, borrowing from Heidegger, an ontotheological synthesis. God, the soul, and the world were still woven into one knot. Early modernity, according to Dupré, strained those threads, connecting them. God became a distant power, the soul disembodied, the world a disenchanted object. Whatever we might think of Dupré's hypothesis, it poses a good question. What does the world that we measure as moderns have to do with mysticism, the soul seeking union with God? The more I think alongside Nicholas of Cusa, the more such questions trouble me. As Tertullian famously asked, what hath Athens to do with Jerusalem? In other words, what does Greek philosophy have to do with the biblical faiths? Or we can ask today, what does geometry have to do with mysticism? What does precise measurement of the world have to do with the ascent of the soul to God? Before the decline of the ontotheological synthesis, did pre-modern mystical theology retain anything like a geometrical, a world-measuring function? Did it retain, so to speak, a kind of geometry? Now, today I have to say, geometry, so to speak. When we invoke geometry today, when I do at least, I do so as a kind of poetic interloper. I don't know if we have any mathematicians here, maybe not. An enthusiast, but an outsider to the discipline. Perhaps what we should say is that we are taking geometry as a metaphor. Or perhaps I have in mind simply the idea of the geometrical measurability of the world, a possibility we could find in literary or religious texts of different kinds, but far from working mathematics. But this is the opposition itself that I wish to examine together today. Precise number versus poetic image, the quantified exterior of the world versus the unquantifiable interior of the soul. Is there an approach to geometry that is non-quantitative? Is that still geometry, and what would it have to do with Christian mysticism? So my talk will have three parts. First, a few minutes explicating the problem with the help of Michel de Certeau. And then I will propose two kinds of non-quantitative geometrical projects within medieval Christian mysticism. We might call these, for shorthand, warm and cool, partly to avoid framing the proposition in terms of one side, the real, quote-unquote, quantitative geometry. Instead, to adopt a figural distinction, warm geometry begins prior to quantity, erotic mysticism. It maps the spatial contours and the intersections of human bodies in erotic mystical texts, mostly by women authors. This is part of medieval Christian mysticism, not all of it, but this is a prominent part that draws a lot of study. The second one, we might call cool geometry, starts within the matrix of precise measurements precise measurements of multitude and magnitude, as in the quadrivium of Boethius, but then it seeks a way beyond quantity, ultimately transcending it. This second option, moving from precise quantity beyond it, is precisely the mystical theological project of Nicholas of Cusa. And so we can examine 3 Cusan strategies in his works to think a kind of geometry beyond the limits of quantity. So that's our plan. The first, Michel de Certeau, the French Jesuit and cultural theorist, died 1986, wrote several books on mysticism, including a famous essay on Cusanus. For Certeau, mystical texts, quote, mark the boundaries of an elsewhere, mark a frontier that divides space, end quote. Each mystical text offers, he says, a theater in which to experiment with different topologies. Like physics or mathematics in the plural, from the Greek plural, Certeau proposes mystics, la mystique, which in his usage means a science of measuring these imaginary spaces. But mystics, mystical theology, should not belong to theology itself. It should remain, he says, an autonomous unit in the system of discourses. It designates a non-place, an atopic space, his terms, outside the ordinary disciplinary map. And so it exposes the modern sciences to, quote, a heterogeneous epistemological system. Now, Certeau contends that this sort of mystical topology or mysticism begins in the 13th century and yet underwent a destabilization, a dissolution, maybe a discreditation in the 17th century. And yet after its passing, he says, it survives, quote, like a ghost that continues to haunt Western epistemologies. It is, quote, a phantom repressed during periods secure in their knowledge that reappears in the gaps within scientific certainty. This absence, end quote, this absence from our disciplinary map, Certeau writes, haunts it. It is, quote, a wild science, science sauvage, that prowls around disturbing the neat measurements of the other disciplines. But why, we might ask, did mystical topology or mystics suddenly dissolve? What happened in the 17th century that overwhelmed it? One obvious candidate is the emergence and valorization of mathematical models of the cosmos in authors like Galileo and Descartes, expanding into a philosophical program in which number and quantity guarantee certain knowledge. On this view, we might ask, perhaps mystics collapsed under the pressure of this competing mathematical determination of space. The quantitative geometrization of space and its homogenizing topology put an end to mystical topology and its heterogeneous spaces. On the other side of that event, where we reside now, mystical space as an idea is then confined to a metaphor, a likeness that's parasitic only on properly quantitative geometry. Space, as it's found in mystical texts, may only appear to us as a fantasy, poetic and metaphorical. But Certeau would say if mystical topology is to carry any critical force, it has to refuse that contemporary exile into poetry, into the metaphorical. In his 1936 lectures, The Crisis of the European Sciences, Husserl feared that the natural sciences so exhaustively analyzed human being that they left no space for philosophy. We find ourselves rich in technology, but poor in meaning. The quantitative measurement of the world, he says, becomes separated from its lived reality, the Lebenswelt. Husserl traces the origins of this crisis to the geometrization of space in Galileo and Descartes. And he predicts that modern philosophy, as a substantive field, will languish until that wound is healed. After Husserl, many contemporary or modern philosophers have addressed similar issues. Husserl's student, Alexandre Koyré, called this the, quote, destruction of the cosmos through the geometrization of space. The late Heidegger writes essays on poetry as a mode of world measure. Gaston Bachelard, in The Poetics of Space, 1957, condemns what he calls the Cartesian cancerization of space, and instead praises, quote, the topography of intimate being found in poetry. We could add Merleau-Ponty, Lefebvre, Foucault. So Surtout, in this sort of tradition, also opposes two regimes of space: geometrical space, or quantitative topology, and mystical space, or non-quantitative topology. And he was convinced that mysticism, like Foucault's heterotopias, might begin to form an answer to Husserl's dilemma. Another name for this dilemma is what I call the metric binary. After the loss of that synthesis in early modernity, the cords tethering God to world and self to world grew frayed. And what remained was a dyad of self and God without the world in our modern constructions of religious experience. This reciprocal polarity of self and God is the point of departure for modern interpretations of religious experience, including studies of so-called mystical texts. In other words, the world is off limits for modern religions. Their proper domain extends to spiritual beings or inner experience, but not matters of precise measurement. This erects a fundamental opposition between the realm of the measurable and the realm of the non-measurable, a binary concerning measure, or a metric binary. In this situation, the human soul is said to be invisible, infinite, unmeasurable, separate from our human bodies and environments. It could be accessed through poetry, but not through measurement. God, too, seems invisible, infinite, unmeasurable, unlike the cosmos. Only the world is the proper domain of measure. It can be measured, but only measured. By definition, anything amenable to quantitative measure seems irrelevant to what we now construct as religious experience. And so today, when we open mystical texts, I worry that our attention is so absorbed by the dramatic exchanges between the soul and God that we don't ask about how it seemed to the mystics themselves who might have written. For pre-modern mystics did not live within that metric binary that we inhabit, and their texts perhaps should not be restricted to that polarity between just the self and God. Before the Renaissance and Reformation, medieval Christian writings that we deem mystical, however, habitually engage the grain of the world, the heavy world of the fleshly human body, the odors of skin and hair, the thirst of the tongue, the pain of the womb. These are visible, tangible elements that inevitably belong to the world of measure and remain subject in some way to quantity. In pre-modern Christian mysticism, are they merely the backdrop for the drama of the unmeasurable soul? I think there is more that we can say here. And so that's what I'd like to explore in these two dimensions. Thinking about mysticism before quantity in a few women authors that we'll look at, and then thinking about mysticism as a resource for thinking beyond quantity. Okay, so our first topic, geometry before quantity. Mystical texts, I think, are not only extrinsic witnesses of an ametric experience, but in truth are inseparable from the measurable world. The problem that mystical texts overcome is not only a distance between the soul and God, they also grapple with a more challenging task that is fundamental to ancient and medieval Christianity. And I'll try to exemplify this claim in what follows. I think that more fundamental task, not just overcoming the distance between soul and God as something disembodied, but rather the task of attempting to unite two closed bodies. One closed body with another. The Christian's tangible body and the risen body of Jesus. I think that's the problem that ancient and medieval Christianity is thinking in some of these texts. To this extent, that's a way to describe the cultural reality that some of these authors were thinking within. To this extent, pre-modern Christianity faces a fundamentally spatial problem of co-locating two real bodies into the same space. And all of the various media, the Eucharist, the icon, the relics, different sacraments, textual experiences later, aim to achieve this impossible conjunction of two closed bodies in one space. It's no accident, then, that medieval Christian mystical texts often focus on the intersection of bodies, bodies that are already within bodies, or bodies on their way in or out of other bodies. And we call these, for obvious reasons, erotic texts about birth, about death, sexuality, hunger. There's a lot of bodily fluids in medieval mysticism, medieval Christianity in general. But what we mean here by erotic text is also, I think, a spatial phenomenon of bodily intersection. Now, if this is what Christian mystical texts do, not unmeasurable experience, but exterior dimensions, then authors of one kind that we typically look to as sort of canonical grounding authorities like Plotinus or even Augustine or Pseudo-Dionysius, they may not be our best or our only guides. If mystical texts instead map the impossible intersection of bodies, there could be other sophisticated models from the margins that disclose this kind of non-quantitative spatiality. So today I'd like to consider three examples, none of them particularly influential for reasons of discourse, institution, and literacy, but the one is notably early. And the three are these three. Now, the first, Vivia Perpetua, is maybe a little bit out of left field. She's from the 3rd century. Hildegard of Bingen would be the more obvious choice. I've written about Hildegard. I wanted to try something else. So we're going to listen to Vivia Perpetua. And also Hadwig of Brabant, the great Dutch mystic from the 13th century, and Julian of Norwich from the 14th and died in the early 15th. Our first example is Perpetua. Our first example is the 3rd century Latin martyrological narrative, The Passion of Perpetua and Felicity. The classicist Thomas Heffernan in 2012 shown, I think, pretty conclusively that the text was composed, surprisingly, by Perpetua herself, a North African mother, 22 years old, wealthy and well-educated. If the text dates, as he suggests, to 203 CE, this makes it not only one of the first Christian mystical texts at all, before Origen and Plotinus, but the first Christian text authored by a woman, and a North African woman. One of the Christians arrested with Perpetua during the persecutions that she underwent is an enslaved pregnant woman named Felicity. Felicitas. Felicity feared being spared by the Romans, since punishing pregnant women was prohibited, but her friends prayed for her in prison, and miraculously she went into labor. A labor with pains terrible because it was a month premature, the text records. Her Roman jailer mocks her and says, quote, "If you are suffering so much now, what will you do when you are thrown to the beasts?" Not very kind. To this, Felicity replies, quote, Now I alone suffer what I am suffering, but then there will be another inside me who will suffer for me, because I am going to suffer for him. Felicity's response to the jailer is deceptively simple. At one level, of course, she's comparing the pain of pregnancy to the pain of martyrdom. Fresh from giving birth, Felicity, the text says, entered the arena stripped naked with the other women. Quote, breasts still dripping with milk, to fight with the beasts, advancing from blood to blood, from midwife to gladiator, washed after childbirth in a second baptism. End quote. Very graphic. But Felicity's analogy that she makes here is not only about blood, but also about space. Now I suffer what I am suffering, but then there will be another inside me, the Latin in me, who will suffer for me, pro me. She compares the child within her body now to Jesus within her body then. It is this continuous maternal identity, precisely, that brings her consolation. She exchanges sufferings with her child now during labor, the child within, who will exit the womb. In death, the body of Jesus will enter within her in May, and again they will exchange sufferings, each for the other. Felicity's retort to her jailer envisions the presence of Jesus as a bodily phenomenon, as a spatial conjunction. It is not an invisible, ametric interiority of soul, indwelling soul. Every line of the Passion, the text, exposes, on the contrary, the physicality, the vulnerability, the perforability of the human body. We read about flesh rubbed down in oil, swollen breasts, hungry infants, milk poured out into open hands, ladders built from spikes, sword striking bones. Jesus for Felicity is a body within a body, just as Felicity held another body within while pregnant, an intersection of two bodies that precedes quantity. Our second example is Hadvig of Brabant, and this is this is a 16th, 17th century construction, but it's on the site of, and there's many of these in Belgium, if you visited these communities that were autonomous female collectives that we call béguinage, that were by women, for women, not monasteries, but also not for the men. Perpetua maps the geometry of pregnancy. Hadvig, the greatest medieval Dutch poet and mystic from the 13th century, takes up the more difficult geometry of two other bodily conjunctions, eating, or ingestion, and sexual intercourse. Hadvig's mysticism begins from an experience of exile from her community. But God's silence amidst her pain, she writes, only fuels her longing for God. And she writes about this in her letters, her songs, her poems, and her visions. 4 genres from one effectively anonymous medieval author who's a woman in the 13th century. It's a remarkable thing that we have. In Vision 7, famously, Hadvig describes her experience of mystical union in a text that's one of the most erotic passages in medieval Christian literature. We'll have it up in a moment. But it's also a spatial event. So Hadvig's visions often describe experiences of mystical union as an intersection of lover and beloved, and in that she's not alone. Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century, the great Cistercian author, does the same. But Hadvig, for example, would write, quote, "My beloved gave himself to me both in spiritual understanding and in feeling." But now in Vision 7, as we'll read, her text moves beyond metaphor to map a real space. Hadvig describes her physical sensations as she yearns to receive the Eucharist. Her veins quiver, she writes. Her bones tremble. She fears she will die of longing. She desires union with her divine beloved and, quote, to taste him to the full. But this text is not only about eating, although it certainly is. She writes, I desire that his humanity should... Let's see, I think I have this text. Yes. She writes, I desire that his humanity, seine Menschheit, should to the fullest extent be one with my humanity, and that mine should content him. I wished he might content me interiorly with his divinity. Now, Hadvig's vision happens while she is preparing to receive the Eucharist in a church. But she narrates this events of the liturgy that she's participating in a kind of virtual space, we would say, of augmented reality. So she sees kind of other shapes and figures superimposed. An eagle flies from the altar as the gospel is read. Jesus appears first to her as a 3-year-old child offering her the ciborium. Finally, the mature male Jesus appears in the form of clothing of a man. And she underscores both human being, Mensch, and man, man, in the medieval Dutch. Then Christ gives himself in the sacrament, both outwardly but also inwardly. And here's the text. After that, he came himself to me, took me entirely in his arms, and pressed me to him. And all my members felt his in full felicity, in accordance with the desire of my heart and my humanity. So I was outwardly satisfied and fully transported. I saw him come completely to naught, and so fade and all at once dissolve that I could no longer recognize or perceive him outside me, and I could no longer distinguish him within me. Then it was to me as if we were one without difference. So she's describing the experience of eating and of the Eucharistic host dissolving within, but she's also obviously superimposing it with a more erotic image. The bodily intersection of ingestion is simultaneously figured a second time. The passing of one body into another, and even the indistinction of auto-affection within each body, is modeled not only as an eating, but as an intimate union of Hadvig's female body and Jesus' male body. We are tempted to classify the passage as a metaphor. And yet Hadvig, who's more than capable of sophisticated poetics in her other works, shows no signs here of irony or distance. Nor does the text report an interior experience of an unmeasurable divinity. On the contrary, in this text, I think we can agree, God could not be more embodied. Rather, this is an intersection of two bodies mapped in two superimposed modes, one of ingestion and one of physical union, two spatial models simultaneously deployed. Our third example is Julian of Norwich. Julian of Norwich's A Revelation of Love is praised rightly for the colors and textures of her arresting visions. There are several degrees of spatiality in Julian's text. I saw God in a point, she repeatedly says. God is the surface of clothing enveloping us, she says. God love spreads out in infinite directions. Famously, she has a notion of Jesus as a mother, which invokes a space of uterine interiority, one body enclosed within another. Our Savior is our true mother, she writes, in whom we are endlessly born, and out of whom we shall never come to birth. And it's clear in the text she's speaking about specifically Jesus by name, not an abstract God. Or another text, our true mother Jesus sustains us within himself in love, and was in labor for the full time to suffer the sharpest pangs. Our tender mother Jesus leads us intimately into his breast through his open side. End quote. But besides these particular images, Julian constructs also a kind of fundamental topology that's not easily mapped. Jesus' maternal care relies upon a fundamental space of reciprocal enclosure. And we'll look at a text in a moment. No doubt, Julian's focus on enclosure drew upon her own concrete experience as an anchorite, a woman literally walled, into the side of a parish church to live her life in solitary contemplation. But from that praxis, she theorizes something much more, a kind of meta-account of mystical theology grounded in this very particular geometry, an impossible geometry of reciprocal enclosure. We are all enclosed in him, and he is enclosed in us. Or again, she writes elsewhere, we are enclosed in each member of the Trinity, and each member of the Trinity is enclosed in us. Or again, Jesus is enclosed in our bodily nature, and our rational nature is enclosed in him. So this comes up a lot. Enclosure is more radical than proximity or union. If we imagine, for example, two spheres, each reciprocally enclosed in the other, that interiority requires one radius to be shorter than the other. But both cannot be shorter, at least in 3 dimensions. Julian's topology of reciprocal enclosure is only geometrically possible in some sort of trans-quantitative space. Perpetua, Hadvig, and Julian provide 3 models of corporeal intersection and therefore 3 models of geometry before quantity. Perpetua, the fungible interiority of pregnancy. Hadvig, the superimposition of ingestion and intercourse. Julian, impossible reciprocal enclosure. Their erotic explorations of the body's inner passages precede the total determination of space by number. If there is, in fact, as Certeau hoped, a wild science of mysticism that haunt the certainties of the modern sciences, it might look something like this pre-quantitative geometry of our daring spatial theorists, these three mystics. Okay, and now our last part, the other kind of geometry, beyond quantity, with Nicholas of Cusa. This part is much more chaste, just so you know, text. The metric binary. The metric binary is the opposition between the measured exterior world and our unmeasurable interior experience. And our question today is, can we undo that by decoupling quantity and geometry? There are two ways to relate quantity and geometry differently. First, we could examine, as we just did, geometries before they are completely determined by quantity. This is the project of a kind of warm geometry, where erotic bodies pass in and out of each other as tangible, multidimensional, but non-calculable spaces. Here, importantly, quantitative and non-quantitative geometries are not opposed to each other, as is our situation, I think, today. But they are harmonized in a sequence of priority. One is before the other, that secures independent legitimacy for each. Now, a second gambit, which we turn to now, is to observe a transition that begins with quantitative geometry, but then moves beyond it to the non-quantitative in the other direction, or perhaps the trans-quantitative. Again, this does not oppose the two, and it also does not relegate one of them to metaphorization. But the transition from one to the other requires them both in place and mobilized. And thinking this transition from quantitative geometry to some sort of experience beyond the geometrical is precisely the intellectual project of Nicholas of Cusa in his mystical writings. So that is to whom we turn now, with maybe a little break and some pictures. So, this is Bernkastel-Kues in the Moselle Valley, a tributary of the Rhineland where Nicholas grew up. This is the Cusanus Hospital, which is a kind of home for elderly adults, a hospice of kind that Cusanus endowed with his estate before his death for 33 men to live there. It still exists today. There is also his library, which you can go visit. And which you can even, if you know the right people, you can pull the books off the shelf and see his annotations, and it was all, miraculously preserved from bombings in the Second World War. There's a legend that there was a Cusanus scholar who ended up in the RAF and was making sure the bombing missions scrupulously avoided Bernkastel-Kues. But that might just be a legend. I don't know. And in the chapel of the hospital, you can see this triptych, and in the center of the triptych is a contemporaneous portrait of Nicholas in the 15th century. So this is him. For Nicholas of Cusa, measuring the world was a mystical experience. He measures stars for calendars and bodily fluids for health. He spent 10 years unsuccessfully trying to solve the quadrature of the circle, that is, to find the ineffable ratio of the straight and the curved. He thought it would kind of be a glimpse into the mind of God, and he failed. But he was most fascinated by the paradox of precise measurement, that the greater the precision we seek, the more our experience of failure in reaching that precision. Nicholas interpreted this predicament, he thought, as a kind of early modern manifestation of pseudo-Dionysian negative theology. He thought it was a mystical experience. The quest for precise measurement is a practice of perpetual negation, driving past every relative quantity in search of an elusive, pure equality. But if negation is, in some mystical traditions like pseudo-Dionysius, if negation is the highest register of theological speech, higher than words is silence, then every mundane act of mathematical measurement as a scientist, in the sciences, in cosmology, every active measurement is itself a revelation of that negative moment, and so an encounter with the mystery of God. To know the world mathematically is to unknow God superlatively, he would say. For God alone is perfect equality and pure precision, so that our rational quadrivial measurements that deal in comparative proportions of lesser and greater can only be inside divisible continua. Awash in a sea of granular degrees, we can never articulate pure precision, for precise equality belongs to God alone, the only true mathematician, in effect. So in a way, Cusanus translates Dionysian apophasis or apophaticism, negative theology, into the categories of the Boethian quadrivium. That's one of his intellectual accomplishments, I think. These quadrivial pursuits led Nicholas to reflect on quantity and magnitude in a particular way, as much as number. In his attempts to relate geometrical quantity to the Christian experiences of God, Cusanus traces a transition beyond quantitative geometry toward non- or trans-quantitative moments when the limits of quantity are overcome. And in the course of these efforts, I propose, Cusanus hit upon three strategies for overcoming the metric binary in each of his periods: an early period with his most important work, On Learned Ignorance, 1440, a middle period, the layman or the idiota, the unlettered person, On the Mind, De Mente, and also a work called The Theological Complement, and the late period, Triologus de Possessed. It does not have to do with possession, but that's a Latin neologism that he invented about posse and esse, about possibility and actuality. Roughly in each of these 3 decades of his works, and we can examine each in turn. So first, the early period. This is one of the best exemplars we have of On Learned Ignorance. And if you look at the bottom of a page, once we get to section 113, you see these strange brown drawings in the margins. And when we zoom in on those, lo and behold, a treatise on mystical theology that has geometrical diagrams penciled in the margins. The first Cusan strategy is to access non-quantitative geometry by means of what he calls an infinite line. In the first book of Deducta Ignorantia, this is it, 113, Cusanus introduces a concept of an infinite line, linea infinita. This is his term for a kind of ideal quantum unit that's limitlessly manipulable, a kind of condition for any quantitative extension at all. And in the chapters that follow, he then, in his mind, in the text, rotates, expands, contracts this line into different shapes. He sketches a series of geometrical diagrams for contemplatives to pray with. The infinite line can be transformed into a triangle, into a circle, into a sphere. It can flatten a curve into a straight line. It can collapse a triangle into a point. This line abides within all beings as their center, as their circumference, and as their diameter. It measures every quantity. Now, to see God with the use of this infinite line, Cusanus proposes a definite method. He writes, "You will also find help in understanding this if you ascend from a quantitative to a non-quantitative triangle." Now, of course, in a quantitative triangle, 3 angles equals 180 degrees. But in infinity, he notes, the angles collapse into an infinite line. He concludes, this supposition, which is impossible with quantitative things, can aid you in ascending to non-quantitative things. What is impossible with quantitative things, he goes on to say, you will see as entirely necessary with non-quantitative things. In another passage, he proposes a 3-step method. First, start with geometrical figures, because geometrical figures are the best, because they reduce the flux of matter into something at least at a minimal degree. Then you take those finite mathematical figures and you transfer them into infinite versions of the same figures, like the infinite line, and then you transcend these by beholding a simple infinite, infinitum simplex, which is entirely liberated from figuration, beyond figuration. In short, his idea of this infinite line guides our mental vision beyond every figure and beyond magnitude itself to glimpse this simple divine ground of any spatial order at all. Middle works. The second strategy is to watch how the mind exceeds quantity as it measures. So instead of looking at the line, now we're looking at the mind reflexively. And to grasp how the mind measures, to grasp its own transquantitative status, to grasp it specifically as a reflection of God, to grasp the mind as the imago Dei in its capacity to exceed the limits of quantity. In one dialogue, not yet this one, Idiote de Mente, 1450, Cusanus defines the mind as the measure of all things. Mind measures itself in every thought. Mind projects number. Mind is the origin of multitude. But mind also measures in terms of points and lines and surfaces. Mind is also the origin of magnitude, so the Boethian quadrivium. Mind's self-assertion is the ground of the quadrivium. So he compares the mind to a polished diamond that's alive, in which all the forms and all the measurements of the world can be reflected. This mirroring power, he says, is ante omnem quantitatem, prior to all quantity. So what does he mean by this? In this treatise, in 1453, called The Theological Complements, part of a two-part work, the first one is geometry, the second part is speculations on geometry. In that work, according to Nicholas, whenever a geometer draws a triangle, she does not reference a quantitative triangular model. Rather, she looks, in a sort of Platonic mode, she looks to a singular exemplar that's neither large nor small, but is fecund with all possibilities. What she sees in her mind is an infinite triangle that's free of quantity and endlessly convertible, and that infinite triangle in the mind is the basis for drawing any finite quantitative triangle. To make it perceptible, it has to be translated into the conditions of quantity. Interesting, but maybe already in Plato. But Cusanus says, when God creates any being, God similarly uses God as a measure, uses God's self as an infinite, non-quantitative figure, and then draws the creature into being. But where a geometer has to apply different angles to transform shapes into another, God transforms beings with the angle of God's self, without any external instruments. Quote, God himself can be considered as the infinite angle, for God is like an angle that is both maximal and minimal. That is to say, God uses God's own angle as an instrument, but the angle is none other than God. And so for Cusanus, God is not just an unmeasurable measure, but an innumerable number. Some of these expressions we see in Augustine already. But God is specifically a number without discrete quantity. Sine quantitate discreta. That's a typo. And God is also great without continuous quantity. Magnus sine quantitate continua. Just as God is transquantitative, and yet still an angle and a number and a measure, the human mind, as the image of God, can think in quantities, but can also transcend quantities. So the very possibility for the mind to think beyond quantity, in quantity, but beyond, is part of its endowment as the imago Dei, because God is already a kind of geometry. Last step. The first Cousin strategy against the metric binary was to see the quantities of the world beyond them with the help of the infinite line. The second one was to grasp one's own trans-quantitative identity as the imago Dei, the image of God. This final Cousin strategy, the third, addresses not the world and not the self, but God. The third strategy takes quantity as a kind of divine name. What would it mean to name God with that name? In the last few years of his life, he dies in 1464, Cusanus thought more carefully about the role of geometry in naming God. Arithmetic had first inspired him in his early works, but after his middle works, I think quantity is at the front of his mind, especially in this late dialogue, Trialogus de Possessed. In the 1440s, Cusanus considered the value of geometrical shapes and figures because they could be swiftly deconstructed and erased. They could lead the mind upward toward seeing the simplicity of God. But now he has a different kind of question. Does quantitative space itself name God? Not as a field for contemplation, but as a kind of divine name. If God is, to use Augustine's terms, the number without number, or the measure without measure, what would it mean then for Nicholas to say that God is a kind of quantity or measure without quantity, a quantity without quantity, a space beyond space? Cusanus answers, first of all, that if we did so, we would first have to negate anything in the concept of quantity that's drawn from the realm of sense and imagination, so that only what remains is a non-quantitative truth of that term. This quantity without quantity, a name for God, would be like any other experience of spatial measure, and yet there would have to be some kind of indefinable analogy that remained. And here Cusanus, with the philosopher, agrees with Aristotle. He agrees with Aristotle that an actually infinite magnitude is impossible and violates the canons of rationality. But Cusanus, the mystical theologian, cleverly finds in that impossibility an opportunity to name God. So he writes this conclusion in two parts. I'll show you A and then B. These are consecutive sentences. First, he writes, since nothing is impossible for God, we should look for God, in whom possibility is necessity, in those things which are impossible in this world. We should look for the divine in the moment of impossibility. That is, if an infinite magnitude is what Aristotle says is impossible, then paradoxically, just that dimension, more than others, could be a vehicle for a divine name, precisely because it's impossible. And second, quote, just as in this world, infinity is actually impossible, so too, a magnitude without end is the necessity that necessitates non-being. Okay, it gets a little abstract there at the end. What does he mean? I always fear getting to that line. Okay. In other words, infinite quantity is the most impossible thing. But God is named precisely at the site of the impossible. If that impossible infinite quantity of God is inexpugnable in our own thinking, then perhaps an access to a geometry beyond the quantitative is a door left permanently open to human thinking. To conclude, Nicholas of Cusa's mathematics is rarely brought into dialogue with the mystical women who preceded him and who, like him, remained on the margins of academic theology. He was a lawyer by day. He never had an academic post. He refused them when they were offered to him. So, a wise man. There is not an ounce of sexuality in the Roman cardinals' chaste treatises, but I think we have discovered some striking resonances between their projects as we look beyond the metric binary in our own age of the world picture. These authors can teach us how to read mystical texts better, despite our late modern blind spots. And they underscore that even mathematical theologies remain grounded in the life of the body, all appearances to the contrary. Perpetua, Hildegard of Bingen, Hodvig, and Julian of Norwich wrote profoundly spatial works. Visionary, sometimes erotic, mystical texts authored by medieval women are not, as we sometimes assume, painted pictures or cinematic dreamscapes or colorful surfaces or surreal fantasies. Perhaps they are those too, but I invite us to think of them also as radical topological experiments, a la Michel de Certeau. The authors of these texts, these mystical texts by women, they are geometers, but they are geometers of a trans-quantitative space. They are, to cite Certeau again, wild scientists. This is the very domain that Nicholas of Cusa attempted to define centuries later, as if theorizing in retrospect and catching up with the women's prescient and sophisticated practice. Thank you.
Come over to the microphone. So we'll go ahead and take some questions so that we're not sharing the microphone. If you wouldn't mind, I'll let you field your own questions. And so we'll take questions. I think we also have someone checking the Zoom chat as well. So with that.
Thank you so much for your very engaging presentation. May I ask you two questions? My first one is, I'm unable to make a distinction between the infinite line given within mathematics and the infinite line that the mystics proposed. So for example, the infinite line as a concept in mathematics would be to define a line, y is equal to ax plus b, and then do a calculation in a finite space, and then use calculus and say limits tend to infinity. And then that is so, there are a lot of parallels in what you said. You take a finite measure, you do the calculation, you integrate it and say as limits tend to infinity. There is an imprecision because you cannot work with infinity. How does the infinite line in mathematics differ from the infinity as the mystics proposed? That's my first question. My second question is, as a medieval scholar who deals with mysticism, how do you think of things like quantum mathematics coming in? Because for the first time, we do have the possibility that information can exist in more than one state. That's the binary. It's called superposition. So when you can have an information in more than one state, which means you can be in two spaces at the same time, something that was not possible before. How do such concepts in mathematics intrigue or bother you? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, those are two good questions. On the first one, there is a lot of scholarship that I don't know as well, but I know it exists out there on Cusanus's relationship to Leibniz and others who are working on the calculus. And there is a passage where he even says, imagine a polygon, a triangle inside a circle, multiply the sides to infinity. The polygon will never quite reach the edge of the circle, but it will approach it at infinity. So it's a sort of an idea of a limit concept, which is there in so many terms. But he doesn't have the calculus himself. He's too early. So I think that is another way of saying, with the infinite line, as an amateur mathematician who made many mistakes and was frequently corrected by his friends who knew better, he was sort of gesturing toward that concept, but it hadn't arrived yet in his own working out of those problems of a limit function. But that is like an analogy on the way to the calculus, I think, not being a historian of mathematics myself. The second question is a very good one, and I don't have a strong answer to that. I mean, that's striking about the idea of superimposition of quantum mathematics and being able to have two different spatial experiences co-located in multiple dimensions. I don't know if, in the same way, analogously, we should say that's a sort of pre-apprehension in that direction by medieval religious imaginary that was thinking along those same lines, or whether someone else could say, well, this is another example of a question that arises in a religious tradition which later receives better definition in the natural sciences, and so kind of removes one aspect of what used to be mystery by defining it in scientific terms. Another example of that is the Cantorian set theory, as I understand it, with trying to render the infinite comprehensible in terms of set theory, that there can be sets of the infinite. It's not something indefinable and mysterious. So that's a very good line of questioning. And there are some philosophers who are interested in trying to think that through to its end, about the sort of proximity of contemporary mathematics and ontology, or henology of the one.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm not an expert on the topic at all, but I'm quite interested in how you think about the relationship between what's erotic, what's sexual, versus what's love. Because I think some of the like the quotes you showed, and I have no background in that at all, but I know that, for example, in Buddhism, we talk a lot about how Buddha dwells in us. Like we all have Buddhist nature, and eventually we can become Buddha, and we are enlightened. That's what they are. And when we talk about that, we don't think about sexual desire at all. And if at all, also in Taoism, we're thinking about getting rid of that part. And I think in some parts of Christianity, we think about our body as kind of a cage or made of, what's that called? Earth, that actually makes us more distinct. That makes us more distant from what our divine nature, we could be connected to our divine nature. And so I think when I was seeing some of the quotes, I don't know if it has to be like interpreted as in like sexually, for example. But I also think the word eros is very interesting because it actually just means life or love, as in like ancient Greek texts, right? So I wonder how we can think about this, and also I guess, and it's definitely pretty blasphemous or wrong to superimpose any like modern feminist perspectives on that. I think it's wrong because
I don't think it's blasphemous. Yes, go ahead. We're okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
But I was wondering also, is it possible that it's because women are writing about these experiences that we tend to think about them as erotic, and when we invoke the word erotic, apparently people think about something else. Because, and I wonder how you can inform me or us about, because I have no background in that at all, about like godly love, because it seems like it could be, in some terms I saw that every form of our desire, for example, even in sexual ones, is kind of a degraded form of love, whereas the eventual one, highest one, is the longing for the divine God. And I wonder how you can approach like these.
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me try two different parts of your question. So there are some Christianity is many things in the ancient medieval world, and there's lots of different schools of thought and things. But the idea of the soul as being trapped in the meat of the flesh, as in a cave, is in Plato. It's in some extent in some Stoic authors. It's in authors, like Lucretius. So there are traditions of that predate Christianity. And Christian reflection on the body that begins with this perception by some Christians, and then it became orthodoxy, that God arrived in the real flesh of the human being. Christians argue about what did that mean for centuries. But I think that means that in the long run, some Christians continued some of those classical traditions of suspicion of the body and of the soul locked within. But more I think, tried to come up with some more complicated view that the soul was integrated with the body, that the soul was an enfolding of the body, or the body an enfolding of the soul, that they're linked, and therefore a spiritual desire has to have some sort of bodily correlate, like a hunger or thirst, a kind of yearning, which includes the sexual, but it's not only limited to that, but a kind of yearning. And the way this is sort of textually prosecuted, there's some signal moments, but one of them, for example, is an author named Origen of Alexandria, an Egyptian philosopher, mid-3rd century, who's writing his, one of the first Christian commentaries on the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs this erotic love poem, the most erotic text in the in the Hebrew Bible, and also the one that never mentions God. So it's an interesting text to read. And Origen was learning from the Jewish communities in Alexandria how to read it allegorically and what to do with it philosophically. But he has this problem because in the Christian text that he already knew, in the Johannine text in the New Testament, God is agape. God is this kind of disinterested, charitable love, compassion. But the Greek texts that he's reading from Plato say, God, that there is something called eros, and that's obviously what's at hand in the Song of Songs text. So the interpretive dilemma for Origen was, God is agape, yes. God is eros, question mark? Can we say that? Can we say also that God is eros? God is erotic longing. God is yearning. This is a paradox because when Plato defines that, it has to do with lack. I lack, food, and so I feel hunger. So does God possess that kind of lack? Is it possible for God to be desire and not only love? And that has consequences for how we think about human bodily desires. But that sort of is a two-pronged path. And I would say very schematically, mystical texts explore that origin path, that God is eros, that eros and agape are one thing. But there's another maybe majority tradition that those should be separable because of our suspicions about eros, because it can be selfish. This is what Augustine represents, the separation of those two. But those are both kind of legitimate, parts of pre-modern Christian discourses, and you can find authors that, engage both and do interesting things with both. Okay, I think I hit both parts there, actually, in my long-winded answer. I hope that answers some of your questions. Yes, Kara.
Okay, so I was thinking the theoretical part of your talk. First of all, of course, thank you so much for this. So many theoretical concepts that you mentioned at the beginning have been endowed either by the authors themselves or by interpretations with, you could say, broadly political meanings, broadly political implications, especially I think of critical critiques of various aspects of modern world. And so given these implications that many of those concepts that I've seen utilized as having, I wonder if you also envisage some similar, broadly speaking, political implications for this research and these findings that you're presenting on the. I'm thinking, for example, of Foucault's heterotropia, but this could be said for all of them, and I wonder if you envision some similar implications for your findings on this.
Yeah, I'm not denying that there are not, those are not there. I guess I'd have to hear more about what you have in mind. My main concern was not that, but to look at the value of these strange texts, both how to read them better outside of our own blind spots, and how they could be useful in a more contemporary vein to think beyond this divide that, at least from the early 20th century, seems to be kind of resident in continental philosophy. And I don't know. I would have to think, to be honest, I'd have to think more about if there are any political implications for this sort of suggestion in parallel, for example, to Foucault. I don't know. I will have to think more about that. Maybe you can share, if you wish, you can share more about if you hear any political implications there.
Thank you. I don't
Okay.
confident enough.
Yes.
That definitely resonated with all this very important theoretical tradition, and so it was evocative of potentialities, I guess, even though.
Yes. Thank you.
We have a question from Zoom. I'll come over and ask here. So on Zoom, we have a question from Simone Panay. Thank you for the fabulous presentation. Wondering if you could say a little bit about the second part of Citeau's text. And Simone says, I seem to remember that Citeau wrote the mystic fable in that very building where this talk is taking place. That is, could you talk about the fable part of the geometry of mysticism? What is there in the superposition of spaces that is a fabula?
Yes, I don't have this right in front of me. I don't think I remember all the parts of it, but when Certeau is defining what mysticism is as a kind of discursive space, he uses the figure of, in that text, of squaring the circle. In other words, it is, he lists 4 different related discourses which are approximating the perfect circle of mystical theology or of mysticism. So he uses the same figure from Nicholas of Cusa of the polygon approaching the circle, or the quadrature of the circle, a geometrical problem in the history of mathematics. But he states these 4 disciplines, and that's what I was trying to write down and remember here. One of them is psychoanalysis. One of them is the orality of the fable, kind of in an anthropological vein, as a second discipline. And the other 2 are escaping my mind. But that is his construction of what mysticism is later in that text. But he sees it as something that's sort of never fully arrived. He sees it as a fruitful, unexplored, discursive possibility, kind of the future, which would have to do with a new triangulation of things that we kind of know about, like psychoanalysis and orality. I think the body is another one. And maybe historiography is the 4th, critical historiography. But put together in a new configuration that sheds light on this specific canon of texts, which from the 17th century we've constructed as mystical texts, but also reflexively sheds light on the interpreter. He says, when we're reading mystical texts, he's like, we're looking at one who has vanished. We're looking at one who has vanished, who is looking at one who has vanished. So there's sort of 2 levels of obscurity. The mystical author themselves is looking at the divine, kind of with their back turned, and with the hidden divine. And then we as historians are trying to read those mystical texts whose back, so to speak, is turned to us. And they're looking at another divine figure whose back is turned to us. So it's a very elliptical kind of notion he has in mind. But as we know, he's contributed a lot to critical thinking about historiography in general. What does it mean to write history? And is a fruitful author for reading up for a lot of different disciplines to that end.
I have a question about Julian of Knowledge,
Yes.
because I got some time to read her work a little bit and the visions that she had about Jesus. I just wonder, some critics say that she had the vision the way it was just because it was imported from the social context at the time. And how do we read that into the, maybe just encounter with the way we read the mystic ways or mystical. I'm sorry. Because you mentioned about the 2 mentions that she kind of received or become like inputs in her own visions, but also there was the surrounding area of where she was, in the monastery. So how that informed her from the historical standpoint, I just wonder.
I mean, to read these sorts of texts well, whether it's Hildegard or Hadvig or Julian, or any others, those are just ones I've been thinking about lately, but and Nicholas of Cusa for that matter, it's always important to understand what their social situation is. Hadvig was in a community and then got ejected from it. Hildegard was in charge of a community of Benedictine nuns. Julian, in a way, was the one, not making light of it, but cut off from community in a way, although because she was walled into the side of the church, but she had lots of visitors coming to see her. Famously, we have contemporaneous accounts of people who wrote and said, I visited Dame Julian and she gave me this spiritual counsel. So we kind of have that as an anchor of our own reading of her as an author. I don't think that it's the case that the more we know about the social conditions of an author as a writer, that means the less original or the less valuable that their own conceptualities would become. Those things happen naturally and all kinds of occasions. The part that makes it most interesting for Julian is that she had an initial experience, she says, on the edge of death, and that she wrote immediately, more or less, into a very short text that's very schematic, the short text. But then she spent 10 years or 15 years meditating upon that and wrote that further out into a longer text, as you know, but I'm sharing with everyone else, that longer text. And in that intervening gap, since we have both recensions, we can see the influence of perhaps some anxieties. Was she being compared to, local dissenters? Was she being faithful to church authority by having her own ideas that she's teaching in the name of Christianity? That was something that was a little hazardous at the time for women to do. So because of that, in her case, we really have this great scholarly tool where we can compare the beginning point and the end point. But I don't think that sort of thing takes away from their originality, or from their originality.
Drew, are there any more Zoom questions? Or
I don't see any right now.
Okay.
I did have one question if we
Sure,
have time.
let's end on your question.
So,
Thank you.
one question is, if you could say more about the relationship between a kind of geometrical theology versus an arithmetical theology, and in particular the legacy of the theory of Chartres, which you've thought so much about, which is very much, not exclusively, but very much tied to discrete quantity rather than continuous quantity, very much tied to an arithmetic way of thinking than a geometrical way of thinking. How does geometrical thinking, enter into the tradition, especially given Cusa's sort of deep connection and careful thinking through theory of Chartres? How do you figure the relationship, both historically but maybe also theologically or philosophically, between between a theology of arithmetic versus a theology of geometry?
Yeah.
Maybe too big a question, but
No, that's a good
any way
question.
you'd like.
I think just sort of in his corpus of texts, it's clear that he starts with questions about number and Pythagoreanism per se. He has a predilection toward geometry. He famously writes 10 or 12 proofs trying to prove the quadrature of the circle. He sends them to his friend Toscanelli, who was a real mathematician. And Toscanelli says, "My friend Nicholas, these are terrible. They're wrong. They keep leading you to dead ends where the proofs are false." And he says, "You must not, like a good philosopher, you must not be understanding my concept." And he refused to revise them. And he would try again. And Toscanelli would say, "Please stop doing this to yourself. It's wrong again." And he was like, "You'll see it one day," So he was interested in the concepts behind it. So I think he clearly has some eye on something beyond just his Boethian 12th century sources, which are pretty exclusively about the creation of numbers, the creation of things, and so forth. And I think part of that for him has to do with that geometry is seen. It's from the invisible to the visible. And this tension between invisibility and visibility, or in mystical, we're talking about in Northern Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, one very hot topic was, are images conducive to the vision of God, or are images an obstacle to the vision of God? So Meister Eckhart in Eckhartian mysticism represents a kind of imageless contemplation that says what you need to do first, Eckhart says, is subtract every image from your field of vision, because any image, he says, even this big, is enough to blot out God in your mind's eye. Because you have to recognize that you are the best image as a human being, and so you should have no images in front of you. You should just sort of recognize that I am the image, and then retreat into your intellect, which is imageless, Versus some other texts, like the mystical texts we've looked at, which are very rich. So Nicholas, even though he kind of sounds on the first side in his earlier works, start with the geometrical, reduce it to the invisible, and then poof, once it's dissolved, let geometry dissolve the visual field, and then you can see better. He writes this work in 1453 called On the Vision of God, which is about how great the colorful visual icon of a Christ face that has an omnivoyant vision, how great it is, and this is everything I've been talking about. So this is the beginning of my sort of quandary, because he's investing in the visual, and there's more evidence of that, more and more and more, 1450s, 1460s. So how do we get from this sort of iconoclast thinker to this iconophilic thinker? And I think the through line is he's thinking so much about quantity and the geometrical, because it is the moment where you have to eventually draw a line, sort of and he's doing this in his practice, drawing lines on pages, Can I use these to see God? Oh, this one doesn't work also. But so I'll write about the icon instead, in so many words. So what is this path from invisibility of number? I think it's toward the visibility of the geometrical of the line. And that's part of his, in the quadrivial language, that's a shift from multitude to magnitude. But he's trying to do both eventually. Maybe even music at the end.
Again, thank you so much, David. Thank you, Drew, and Programming Medieval Studies, and I hope you have a great evening.